I'm Ed Waldrop, Master Tech at iCracked, the world's largest on-demand smartphone repair service. Today's video will be the display replacement on the iPhone X. So one thing we'll do is make sure that the phone is shut down. While it's powering down, we'll go ahead and cover some of the tools. First, you're going to get a replacement gasket that goes between the display and the frame, a tri-wing screwdriver, which you can tell by the Y on there. And inside the kit, you're going to have an ESD safe nylon spudger, a pentalobe screwdriver, a Phillips screwdriver, suction cup for lifting the screen, pry tool, and a guitar pick, which may not be needed, but sometimes comes in handy. First thing what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove the two pentalobe screws located at the left and right side of the charge port. These are very long screws. I'm going to take a heat source, such as a hot air gun or a hair dryer, and go ahead and heat the display up. What this is going to do is soften the gasket that sits between the display and the frame to make it easier to come off. I'm just heating the edges, and I'm doing it just enough to where I can still hold and touch it. I'm not going too close because there's over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit coming out of this hot air gun. And the last thing you want to do is damage your work surface or the phone itself from using excessive heat. So it's just enough to where you can touch it. Now, if a screen is badly shattered, you're going to take a piece of tape and put on there so it gives you a nice smooth surface for the suction cup to grab. I'm going to put the suction cup on here, and I'm going to pull just enough to where it starts creating a gap along the phone, and then taking my pry tool and inserting it. What I'm doing here is I'm going to break the gasket seal along the edge. I'm using my finger here to kind of keep the display up so it doesn't reseat, and I'm going all the way around. Then the screen should pop up, take a look, and go ahead and knock out any of the gasket that may be sticking to it. If your phone accidentally powered on, go ahead and power it back off. So we don't want to go any further unless it's off. Again, I'm just running through here, breaking the gasket. Now you'll notice on this edge there's a couple of cables, and the last thing we want to do is damage these cables, so be very cautious while you're in here cutting that cable, cutting the gasket, so we don't cut the cable. Now that that's done, we'll go ahead and open it like a book. And you've got the cable here, which comes to your sensors up here, which is your ear speaker, microphone, ambient light sensor, proximity sensor, and the flood sensor. If this cable or this is damaged, the Face ID will no longer function. So you want to take every precaution possible not to damage this cable. Over here, you've got the LCD and the digitizer cables, which are held in place on this retention plate. Now the first thing we want to do here is get our trusty tri-wing and remove the retaining plate holding all the cables into the logic board. You notice the screws are not the same size. You need to keep them organized. They have to go in the same place they came out. If you mix up the screws, you could potentially render the phone irreparable. Now that all the screws are out, I'm going to go ahead and lift up the retaining plate and remove it. The first thing I want to do is disconnect the battery, which is this cable right here. So we're disconnecting any power source, so there's no potential for electronic damage, hopefully. So next, I'm going to go through and disconnect the two cables on the display itself, coming in on this edge, using the pointed end of my nylon spudger, and pop the cable up. And then the next cable. Now, the cable for Face ID, this cable here, which is connected to Face ID, runs along here, and there's adhesive underneath here. So you want to be very careful in coming in and separating that from the cables down below. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to disconnect it from the logic board and very cautiously lift that up and pull that display away. I'm going to set the display aside. I'm going to come through and start cleaning up all the old adhesive. One thing you don't want to do is use any metal tools while you're cleaning up this adhesive, because if you slip and puncture a battery, you could potentially start a fire. Come through here. Now, the warmer your frame is, the easier the gasket comes off. So if you're having a hard time, just give it a little blast of heat to make it a little easier on you. And you see it comes off relatively easy. Then again, it depends on how old the phone is and how it's been treated. Now along the top, I'm just going to use the pointy end here, making sure that I don't touch any of the sensors with my fingers, because I don't want to transfer any skin oils onto the lenses, because that could potentially affect how it functions. Okay. Run here real quick, make sure I got all the adhesive up. Okay, now that it's up, I'm going to go ahead and lay down the new gasket now before I get started anywhere else. So if you take a look at the gasket, you want to make sure it's in the correct way, and you're going to notice all the cutouts that line up inside here so it doesn't land on the cameras or the flash, any of the sensors and so forth. So I'm going to remove the very large outer edge. This is multiple layers. I'm going to take this and I'm going to align it inside the frame. And then slowly walk it down with my fingers. There we go. And then I'm going to take the flat edge of my nylon spudger and I'm going to press that gasket into place along the frame edge. Now you notice when I use the flat edge along the bottom, I have it at a slight angle. Makes it easier to come across here. Great. Now I can remove the top layer. Which then leaves my gasket in place with the third layer sitting there so it doesn't accidentally stick to my display when I go to reconnect everything. So now I can go ahead and set this frame aside. The new display, the only thing that you're going to have to do is remove this entire assembly and transfer it over to the new part. What you're going to notice here is there's 3 tri-wings holding this to the assembly, and then you've got this big long cable. So I'm going to remove the 3 tri-wings. Again, making sure you don't get these mixed up so they go back in the same place they came out. Now this one here at the top also has a grounding tab, so you want to make sure you don't lose that little gold grounding tab. So now the assembly here is a little tight. The ear speaker itself has a grommet around it with some adhesive. So we're going to come in here and we're just going to very gently lift that up. Now you may have to heat this area of the screen if it's fighting you. Don't force it. Like I said, if you damage this assembly, you will no longer have Face ID functionality. So I'm going to come in here and do that. So I've successfully lifted the ear speaker up. Then you've got this sensor here, which also has some double-sided adhesive, so you're going to have to gently pry that up. And then you've got the microphone assembly over here, which I'll come under and very gently nudge it. Again, if it's fighting you, heat, and heat. You don't want to get it so hot that you can't touch it, but you want it warm enough so the adhesives will easily let loose. I'm going to come in and just sort of nudge the microphone out of place. There we go. Now that the microphone's free, the sensors are free, now we've got the flood instrument sensor, which is located down here, which is held in with, again, adhesive. Now I've rolled this out of the place, the infrared sensor kind of out of place, which will then give me access to where the flood instrument sensor is. I'm going to once again heat my screen because I do not want to damage this. I'm going to very gently come in here and nudge this assembly out. Now, if you're having a hard time, I would highly suggest using a pair of tweezers just to get underneath the plastic here and sort of push that up to where it pops out. You want to take a look, make sure there's no rip, tears, or damage to these cables. As you can see here in the display, you've got this adhesive here, the adhesive around the ear speaker, and the adhesive around the IR sensor. And those are pretty delicate. Now we're ready to place this on the new display. All right, so now we have our replacement display assembly. And the first thing I'm going to do is just pull off the protective backing for the upper microphone. I'm going to take the assembly here, make sure it's all set up in line. First thing we want to do is go ahead and drop the flood sensor in place. Okay, it should drop down and stay there. Okay, then I'm going to take the sensor here, fold it over, and put it down in its slot. And this should now allow the front microphone to correctly align and assembly to all sit in place. So I'm going to take the two lower tri-wings, put those in place and get those threads started. Then you've got the ground tab, which sits on here. Tweezers are going to come in real handy setting this in place. Okay, as you see its position, then I'm going to take my final tri-wing, and then I'm going to hold the ground tab in place while I put this down, because the end of it is magnetic and it does want to walk all over the place. And I'm going to set that down and tighten it, holding it against this edge so it doesn't move. So that the ground tab is correctly located. And then I'll go ahead and tighten the other two tri-wings down. Okay. That's it for transferring over to the new display assembly. So I'm going to take the phone and I'm going to connect the lower cable first. Okay, again, outside edge, and then center. To make sure it's correctly in place. You don't want to force these connections in, because we don't want to bow the connector at the end of the cable. Okay, outside. There's a lot of foam around these, so it makes it a little harder. So I went outside edge, and then I push it to where it's seated. I'm going to take this one here, which is kind of tricky because it actually folds over onto itself and will sit between the logic board and the battery. Make sure it's connected. Outside edge to outside edge, and then push into place. You'll feel it sit. One thing you want to make sure is that when you put this in, that you follow the fold. You want to make sure the cable's tucked against the lower edge of the logic board and it's re-adhered to the area we peeled it off earlier. The reason being is if this cable is sitting up, you could catch it with the retaining plate and end up cutting it. So carefully make sure that it is well out of the way. And then lastly, I'll connect the battery. I'm just going to check all cables one last time. Make sure every cable is seated, even though I didn't touch them. Check one last time that that cable's not going to get pinched by the retaining plate when I set this in. And it's fairly easy to tell when you go to put the retaining plate on, because you should see a gap and be able to move that cable. If not, then it's caught underneath, and that's bad. I'm going to start putting the screws back in place. I'm just starting the threads. I'm not completely running them in. Be very careful with your tools. If you slip and puncture the battery, again, you could potentially cause a fire. Once all the screws are in place, I'm going to go ahead and make sure they're all tightened. You don't want to over tighten them. You want to take caution so you don't strip the heads, because using a tri-wing can very easily strip the head of these screws. So don't over tighten, just enough to where it's stopped. Again, take a last look. Make sure that cable's not cut under that retaining plate. Now if you look here, you're going to see that the cable has natural folds where it sits. And then down over here, where you're going to really see is when you close it, is this little dip in the cable is going to fall into a cutout inside here. Now I'm going to take the adhesive backing off the internal gasket. This should come off in 3 strips. And you notice I'm holding the display up so that I don't accidentally get that gasket to stick to the screen yet, because I don't want that to happen. Now what I was telling you here on the cable is it's going to sit down into this open area here. So what I'm going to make sure happens is I close this edge down and get the display on that edge. I'm not pushing it in, I'm just making sure that cable drops into there. And then come along and press it down. Make sure it's lined up all the way around. And then set it down into place. Now you really want to look along here to make sure it's completely popped in. This is a very, very tight fit. You should add even bezel between the edge here along all the way to the outside. If you have any area over here that's popped up, that means your cable's caught. So you're going to have to relift that and replace the gasket again so that you have that seal. And you should especially check all 4 corners. Make sure they're all the way down. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it back on, and while I'm doing it, I'm going to put in the pentalobe screws back in. Now the gasket should help retain the IP67 rating, but it does not guarantee that you will retain the IP67 dust resistant ability. Now remember, IP67 is dust resistant and water resistant for 1 meter up to 30 minutes. Even if you get your phone display replaced by the manufacturer, they will not guarantee the IP67 after they've replaced the display assembly in store or in their depot. The only time it is guaranteed is when the phone is brand new. And if you read across the warranty on the IP67, it says over time, the gasket can break down, and they do not guarantee that. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my code. I'm going to lock it, make sure Face ID works. So now I know I didn't damage the Face ID components because it unlocked the display. I'm going to run through my cameras, make sure they're functioning, and that upper microphone to make sure it's aligned. Testing 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. To make sure it's aligned. Testing 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. So it's nice and loud, so we know that the microphone set itself into place. The front camera worked, back camera worked, and we'll run through all the other tests. Make sure that touch is working. Make sure force touch is working. I'm satisfied that this repair went successful. Thank you for watching the iPhone 10 do-it-yourself display assembly replacement video. If you run into any problems or just need to ask a general question, feel free to visit iCracked.com and click at the help link at the bottom of the page to go through some of our troubleshooting steps.